Well, with Gonzaga getting smacked by Texas on Wednesday and considering North Carolina's pedestrian start to the season, the best basketball team in the NCAA right now sure looks like Kelvin Sampson's Houston Cougars.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton. Today's episode is brought to you by Underdog. Sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com with promo code Locked On, and you will get your first deposit doubled of up to $100. While Gonzaga struggled with Michigan State and then fell badly to Texas, and North Carolina has struggled with their relatively easy opponents so far this year, the Houston Cougars sure look like the best team in all of college basketball. Locked On Cougs host Parker Ainsworth is here to join me today. Parker, is anybody playing better basketball than the Cougs right now?
I admittedly have watched a lot of Houston Cougar basketball and only a dozen other teams or so, but I don't know about anyone else. No.
Yeah. Yeah, this team has been absolutely rolling lately at Texas Southern. Texas Southern is yes, they're an SWAC team. Yes, I know that they're not exactly an opponent that most people are going to look at and say, hey, you know what? That's the kind of marquee victory you want early in the season. Certainly Gonzaga did beat Michigan State, and certainly there are other teams that have picked up bigger wins, but I've seen Texas Southern play a lot of basketball. I've seen them. They have a very rigorous non-conference schedule. It's a big part of what they do as a program. And you know what they don't do very often? They don't get beat by 40. It doesn't happen to them very often, even when they play teams like Gonzaga, when they play other Power 5 programs. They don't lose like this all of that often. Houston just took it to them in this game. And right now, again, obviously Kansas is in that conversation. Obviously Baylor is in that conversation. Heck, most of the teams that are in this conversation for best team in college basketball right now are located in the great state of Texas. Baylor, Texas, and Houston are three of the best teams in college basketball right now. But looking at this Houston team, doesn't look like there's a whole lot of weaknesses so far this season. Parker, what have you seen?
Well, it's a Kelvin Sampson defensive team, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, Texas Southern by 45. They beat Oral Roberts, another team that's usually in the tournament. They beat them by 40 as well, 38 as well. St. Joe's is got history behind the program, and they beat that team by almost 30. They've just been trouncing teams. And it's because of a suffocating Kelvin Sampson defense. We'll get talking about future top 10 draft pick Jarris Walker at some point, I'm sure, because you can't talk about this team, not talk about him. Mm-hmm. One of the more impressive things, though, in college basketball is guards are super important.
Yeah.
And Jamal Shead has been taking away other teams' best guards, right? Texas Southern came in with a 22 point per game score. He held him to 9, right? Or Roberts came in with a guy that had 24 game last year. Jamal Shead held him to 3, right? He just shuts down your best scoring guard and says, you got to be with something else. And so far, no one has.
When you have a player who can do that on that end of the floor, you look at, again, we'll use Gonzaga as the example, or even you look at North Carolina. North Carolina has Leaky Black, exceptional defensive player, but they've given up a lot of points to teams that normally you wouldn't expect North Carolina to give up 80, 85, 90 points to. Gonzaga has struggled massively on the defensive end of the floor against Texas in particular, but for Houston, that is their calling card. They have this really good defense. They have a lockdown guard in Jamal Shead that is an incredibly important skill to have, not just now in November, because whatever you have now in November, it matters to an extent, but it doesn't matter that much. It matters more what you have in March. And when you have a lockdown defensive player like that, think about how many great NCAA runs would have been stopped. Do you think Kemba Walker and UConn go all the way if there's just a lockdown defensive guy to go out there and shut him down? That's what you need. That's how St. Peter's goes on a run. Obviously Houston and St. Peter's are very different programs, but St. Peter's does something like that because they have lockdown defense. They have a consistent and a really, really good defense from top to bottom. And Houston absolutely has that. And then you have a guy like Marcus Sasser. I know we're going to talk Jarris Walker because having watched Jarris Walker, I'm just so excited about that young man and the potential he has. But everything really starts in Houston with Marcus Sasser. And right now with Drew Timme has had good games, but he hasn't been elite yet. Oscar Tshiebwe obviously coming off an injury. You still got Trayce Jackson-Davis and Hunter Dickinson, who are both having strong starts to the year. But Marcus Sasser is solidified himself in this conversation for National Player of the Year, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and obviously, he probably would have been a late first round or early second round draft pick had he gone last
Mhm.
summer. He opted to not and come prove himself. He has a potentially a pick in more like the teens, and he
Mhm.
looks like a pro playing college basketball.
Yeah.
I thought it was fascinating in the Texas Southern game. In his last season, he had he shot like 44% from three.
Yeah.
Against Texas Southern, he went 0 for from behind the line, still had 20 points because he was like getting to the rim, finding ways to get involved, and it was a professional way to go about it. My jump shot's not falling. I'm finding something else, some other way to impact winning in this basketball game. And he is so crafty. He like attacks the nail like the middle of the floor and like puts whatever the help defender is on skates and cuts back to the rim. He's really crafty in that middle of the floor area.
How about that 18-year-old kid, Jarace Walker? What an incredible start to his career. It's like the young and the old. Marcus Sasser, one of the more veteran guys in college basketball, certainly a guy who's been around the block a little bit. Jarace Walker, though, he does not look like an 18-year-old kid. He was out there doing Euro steps, throwing down alley-oop dunks against Texas Southern. It'll be exciting, obviously, when we get to see some of Houston's later games. They got Alabama, they got Virginia, they got St. Mary's, they got Oregon coming up on the 20th. Those games are going to test him a little bit more, but I have a hard time not imagining he's going to pass those tests.
Well, and it's like you said, he is the 5-star McDonald's All-American caliber athlete that just shows up to Houston in a way that like probably says more to us about him, right? He signed up for the mid-major smaller school to play for a coach like Kelvin Sampson is going to work him hard. And he's 6'9", 230, chiseled like a Greek god with a floater and a 3-point shot. Like he does all the things. I think the most impressive thing about him is again on the defensive side, he protects the rim like a 7-footer, right? He takes the 2-step gallop and defends both sides of the backboard and rim in a way that is really advanced for a 6'9", 18-year-old. Kelvin Sampson said he's a great passer. That's what Kelvin Sampson said, but I'm going to stick with the defense, I think.
Sure. Okay, well, last question for you, Parker, before I let you go. If the Houston Cougars go to the Final Four, if they're playing at home in Houston in the Final Four, somebody not named Jamal Shed, Marcus Sasser, or Jarace Walker, who do you think is going to have the biggest impact for this team? You can't say Sampson either. We're not going to let you count. Coach doesn't count. Another player. I know this is a deep team, but who's that fourth guy who's going to really impact this program and this team if they're going to get to that point?
So I got two quick options. One as a starter would be Tremont Mark. He's the third guard, small forward type. He's a long 6'5". He's already got a 20-point game under his belt this season. He injured his shoulder middle of the season last year and didn't get finished this season. He looks back and completely healthy. If you have attention at all other places, he can hurt you. Yeah. And then this other freshman, Terrence Arsenault off the bench, is from up the street, Beaumont United. He stayed at home to go to Houston. He was a 5-star kid as well. 2-time state champion at the state of Texas, biggest division. He has a bunch of other individual accolades from high school under his belt. And there's just some magic in the water about this kid who he just has a knack for finding the ball defensively. Making a big play in the Final Four in Houston would just kind of feel storybook-like, right?
Well, Gonzaga and Kentucky meet up on Sunday at the Spokane Arena. Will the loser of that game, who would now have 2 losses heading into Feast Week, is it possible they will be outside of the AP Top 10? Today's episode is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, the easiest place to spice up the college basketball season. It's super easy to sign up and get started, and each game can be a different bet or pick'em choice from your favorite college basketball stars. You think Oscar Tshiebwe's chances of putting up big numbers against the Zags on Sunday, or maybe you're feeling a big game from Drew Timme? Go to the Upside app and drop your bet. Easy money. Bet Timme or Tshiebwe or 1 to 4 other players, and you could win cold, hard cash. Sign up with the promo code LOCKEDON, one word, and Underdog will double your first deposit of up to $100. So deposit $100, get $100 free. Go to UnderdogFantasy.com or find the Underdog Fantasy app in the App Store or Google Play Store. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code LOCKEDON, one word. Get in on the pick'em action today. Well, the Gonzaga Bulldogs and Kentucky Wildcats have a 6-year home series scheduled, and we're starting it on Sunday, November 20th. I didn't expect to be going into this game with each team already having a loss on the docket. One of these 2 teams is going to be a 2-loss team heading into Feast Week. Joined today by Lance Daw of Locked On Wildcats. Lance, as far as mid-November games go, it kind of feels like this one's got a bit more urgency on either side than we would have expected based on the first couple games of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a shock, Andy. I did not expect either of these teams to be in a position where they could potentially have 2 losses just straight out of the gate. I mean, that Texas loss the other day that Gonzaga had just a little out of the blue for me in just terms of the margin of victory for the Longhorns. And then Michigan State, you go back and watch that game for the Wildcats. It looked like a game that Kentucky had several opportunities to win. I would still say that Kentucky is a more talented team as far as coaching goes. We could have an argument there about what's going on the sidelines. But yeah, just kind of a shock heading into this one. It's kind of startling. Obviously, Kentucky's going to have a game in between South Carolina State. They're going to have an opportunity to kind of fine tune some things, get some things ready for that affair in Washington. But yeah, just kind of surprised at the way both teams are walking into this one. A little bit more desperation maybe to kind of pick up a resume building win. Yeah,
and it's funny, I think it's easy to look at the two games. Obviously, Gonzaga also played Michigan State. The Spartans, incidentally, one bad possession away from being 2-0 against Gonzaga and Kentucky. Incredible start to the season for that team. And I think one of the big takeaways that I had watching both of those games is that Michigan State is better than people expected. They are a top 25, top 20, maybe top 15 team. But at the end of the day, Gonzaga and Kentucky, they don't normally have a lot of losses coming into this game. Gonzaga got smoked by Texas, a really, really tough loss for them. The defense was just not there. And now you have a Kentucky team that looks a little bit tenuous. Yeah, they've had some health issues, but Sheboy and Severe Wheeler both played against Michigan State. It's not like they were the two best players on the floor for the Wildcats, so it's not like that was a huge inhibitor for them. I'm curious, kind of looking ahead, one of these two teams is going to lose. Are we going to have a situation where one of these two teams is outside the top 10 going into Feast Week? That is not something that I would have predicted. We knew they'd have one loss. Somebody was going to have a loss because of the Gonzaga-Kentucky game on Sunday, but we're looking at a situation where Houston looks phenomenal. North Carolina hasn't lost yet. They haven't looked great, but they haven't lost yet. Kansas is right in there. Duke obviously has the Kansas loss, but they're a great team as well. Texas, you got to move them into your top 6, 7, maybe 5 after that win. So I'm curious if you're thinking that one of Gonzaga or Kentucky could potentially be outside the top 10 going into Feast Week.
Well, I think it's interesting because this was a question one of my listeners asked me a few weeks ago. They asked me, not necessarily caring about preseason rankings, but what do you think about where the rankings will be come a month into the season? What will the top 10 look like? And I would have never predicted that the Wildcats or Gonzaga would be bounced out of the top 10. I definitely think it's a possibility, especially when you look at the rankings. Every single team in the top 15 outside of TCU won their first game this week. So like you mentioned, Texas is going to be moving up. I'm sure that Arkansas will probably be right there as well. There are a couple teams outside of the top 10 that you could look out. Oh, and maybe moving up, maybe Indiana, maybe Auburn. So I definitely think that it's a possibility that whoever loses this game, depending on how bad they lose it, they could take a step into that 9 to 11 range. I definitely think that it's possible to find them maybe a spot underneath it. So I would say absolutely, especially consider, and I hate to rag on it, Andy, considering you're the host of Locked On Zags, but the margin of victory for Texas is the thing that concerns me here, because if Gonzaga loses, I can definitely see the voters respecting the fact that these are two really good teams still, but also you can't put a 2-loss team that loses by double digits in back-to-back games. You can't keep them in top 10, especially with the other teams that are there. So I would say, yes, absolutely. It's a possibility.
Yeah, I think Gonzaga is certainly more in danger. Kentucky, if they lose a close game to Gonzaga, they lost a close game to Michigan State. It sucks to have 2 losses, but we're considering Michigan State a top 20 team. If Gonzaga wins that game, they're still probably a top 5 or 6 team. So for Kentucky to have 2 really close losses against that caliber of opponent, they're probably not dropping all that much, nor should they drop all that much. If Gonzaga plays the same level of defense against Kentucky as they did against Texas, the score might look kind of similar. In that case, Gonzaga is plummeting, and deservedly so, because you can't get away. I mean, they played bad defense against Tennessee in an exhibition game. It didn't count, but people remember that. And the Michigan State game was sloppy and messy because games on aircraft carriers tend to be sloppy and messy. But Gonzaga still barely pulled that one out. And a loss to Kentucky after getting blown. I mean, they nearly lost by 20. It was the first time since 2010 the Zags would have lost by 20 points. They ended up only losing by 19, but still, that is an alarming stat for the Bulldogs. I want to talk a little bit more about the actual game taking place on Sunday. We know one of these teams is going to lose, of course, but it could really go either way. These teams are still 2 top 5 teams, are going to be top 5 teams when that matchup occurs. For me, looking at Gonzaga, their guard play has been a significant issue. early in the season. One thing that has been kind of known about Gonzaga really since the Baylor game in 2021, the national championship game, is putting a lot of pressure on their guards, especially early in the shot clock when they're just getting crossed half court, making it more difficult for them to find a way to get the basketball into Drew Timme's hands. That has been a recipe for success. Michigan State took it away from them. Texas really took it away from them. 20 turnovers in that game. Fortunately for Kentucky, unfortunately for Gonzaga fans, the Wildcats have some players who could really do a lot of damage in that situation. For me, freshman Cason Wallace, 8 steals against Michigan State. He's big, he's tough, he's physical. He plays like somebody who's not a true freshman, and he seems like he's going to be a big problem for the Bulldogs on Sunday.
My favorite player on the team, hands down. Heading into the season, I was talking about how this guy's going to be a stud and that Kentucky's going to really, really value the minutes that he gets. I think that he is one of the most valuable pieces in that backcourt. You talk about the issues for Gonzaga, and I'm going to get to Kentucky's backcourt in a second, but Cason Wallace, he had 5 steals at halftime against Michigan State. And it's something where you just watch him as a defender. Whoever his high school coach was, man, he had him ready to go. I mean, you talk about, just getting square, getting set, knowing what's going to happen, anticipating things, timing things correctly. You talk about the size to go along with it as well, 6'4". I mean, this guy's just an absolute athlete, and he's a phenomenal defender, one of the best on-ball defenders, I think, already in college basketball. I think that he could potentially be a problem for this Gonzaga team, but I think one of the issues or an area of deficiency for the Wildcats is their backcourt as well, potentially. So they've got a couple of shooters in Antonio Reeves and CJ Frederick. I think you question Antonio Reeves defensively, what he's able to do for the Wildcats, because at times he has not looked phenomenal. You look at the games in the Bahamas, you look at the first 2 games of the season that he's contributed significantly in. He's a guy that I think you have to watch as maybe not necessarily a defensive liability, but just somebody to keep an eye on. And then you talk about these 2 guys as shooters. They both shot terribly against Michigan State. If they get hot, it's a really, really tough thing. It's a really, really difficult thing for Gonzaga to stop. But if they can't, and then also you bring that defense into question, especially in transition, I think it's an area where Gonzaga could take advantage. You look at the KenPom numbers, Gonzaga right now, top 30 in an average possession length on offense, top 15 in adjusted tempo. I mean, they like to get up and down the court, and Michigan State found their most success getting up and down the court, especially late in that game. So I think Kentucky's backcourt, guys like Cason Wallace, are going to keep them in this game. But you have concerns about the defense. The final thing I'll say here about Wallace, I expect to see maybe a little bit more consistency. You look at his statistics in regulation: 10 points, 8 steals, 5 assists, 4 rebounds, a block, no turnovers in 34 minutes. In the 2 overtimes, he had 4 points, no steals, no assists, 1 rebound, no blocks, and 3 turnovers in those 10 minutes. You've got to see better production at the end of the game, especially if it gets close. I think you talk about this kid not playing like a freshman. He didn't play like a freshman for about 34 minutes, but whenever it came to crunch time, it was maybe a mental issue for him. You're going to need to see more production out of this Kentucky backcourt. I think that starts with Cason Wallace because of how valuable he is on both ends of the floor.
Last thing I want to talk about with you, Lance, is obviously the big matchup, the one-on-one matchup between the 2 National Player of the Year front-runner candidates, Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky and Drew Timme at Gonzaga. Of course, it's been talked about to death how these 2 guys are both products of kind of the same era of big basketball players, really talented in the college game, don't really translate as well to the NBA game just because they don't have that outside shot. Because of NIL, because of the ability to make money playing in college, we're seeing these guys return. Of course, there's more: Armando Bacot, Trayce Jackson-Davis, Hunter Dickinson, all kind of in this conversation as well. But these are the big 2, and they're going to go at each other for the first time since a couple years ago when Tshiebwe was at West Virginia. How excited are you for this matchup between these 2 guys?
I'm thrilled. I mean, offensively, I think they may be the 2 best players on the floor for each team in this matchup. I'm really excited to see Tshiebwe, had that knee surgery, came back for the Michigan State game. I discussed that with Isaac Shade here on the Locked On College Basketball podcast about I expected him to be back and perform, and he performed very, very well. Had 22 points on 9 of 17 shooting, had 12 defensive rebounds, 6 offensive rebounds, 18 total. Played very well for the Wildcats. And then Drew Timme played efficiently in that loss to Texas. I mean, he's just continued to truck along. So offensively, I think these 2 players are going to be fun to watch. I think something important to take note of is while Tshiebwe is a very good defender at the rim, he does not get a ton of blocks. Well, he had 4 against Michigan State. and that's his first game back. Maybe that's something that he's worked on, the timing, the anticipation. Defensively, I think it's going to be fun to see how these two guys match up with each other as well. Can they slow each other down? Don't know if necessarily they're going to be able to, but man, I'm excited about it. Could be the biggest thing in this game is whichever big man really kind of asserts himself could kind of determine the outcome of this one.
Well, the Gavitt games roll on this week as number 12 Indiana faces their first real test of the season against Xavier on Friday. Are the Hoosiers pretenders or are they contenders? Today's episode is brought to you by Nugenix. Feeling like you just can't get in shape? It's not your fault. As men age, our body naturally loses free testosterone. It happens to every man and can make it more difficult to stay in shape and be energetic and be active. Wouldn't it be nice to get that winner's edge again and that old swagger back in your step? Want more energy to counter the negative physical effects of aging? Nugenix Total T Testosterone Booster with Testofen will help you turn back the clock, re-energize your workouts, get you better results at the gym, and help you look and feel like the man you really want to be. While every product professes quality, many other products use generic ingredients that are often far less than clinical grade. With Nugenix Total T, you get the same clinical potency levels used in the trials. And Nugenix formulation is backed by 10 years of science and research. Nugenix Total T can help re-energize your life and help you get back to the powerful, confident, good-looking warrior that you used to be. Now get a complimentary bottle of Nugenix Total T when you text college to 231231. Text now and get a bottle of Nugenix Thermo, their most powerful fat incinerator ever, with key ingredients to help you get back into shape fast. Absolutely free. Text college to 231231. Well, we know the AP poll is going to look a little bit different after this weekend. One team that could benefit from all the potential shakeups that we're going to see is the Indiana Hoosiers. They have a really nice matchup coming up on Friday against the Xavier Musketeers. Jacob Root is here of Locked on Hoosiers. Jacob, this is the first real test for Indiana this season, and Indiana's kind of an interesting spot. They came into the year with a lot of expectations, despite not really having a ton of success. They're 16-23 in their last two seasons in the Big Ten. We have discussed before how they didn't really lose anybody this last offseason, have a really talented squad returning, of course, anchored by Trayce Jackson-Davis. Now they finally get a chance to really go out there, play a top 40 team on the road in Xavier. How critical is it for Mike Woodson and the staff here to pick up a win in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of referred to this along with the women's team that played Tennessee earlier in the week as kind of a prove-it week in Bloomington. It's just, as you were saying, this is a team that almost kind of by default has moved up to the top of the Big Ten, and now it's a matter of do they belong there? And this is the first test. They're going to have much bigger tests later on in the year, but this is the first one that is going to determine kind of early on how good this team is. So it's going to be interesting. It's a sneaky kind of tough game for Indiana here.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those games where, Xavier's not ranked. They're 38th in KenPom, so they're not super close to being ranked necessarily. I can't remember if they picked up votes last week. I suspect they probably did.
They did.
They're kind of right in that conversation. But true road games are tough, and true road games early in the year, it's something we've seen a lot of this season. I mean, obviously the Gonzaga getting smacked by Texas was a good example of that. True road games. The Pac-12 played a bunch of road games against SWAC teams and went 3-3 in some of those contests. So I think the true road environment, especially early in the season, especially in kind of an era where roster turnover is pretty significant, and you see a lot of teams where maybe they have experienced teams, but that experience all hasn't necessarily come together. They haven't all played on the same team before. For Indiana, that's not as much of the issue. This is generally a team that has played together, has some of that cohesion, some of that stuff built in already with Coach Woodson, but this is still going to be a really challenging game for them. I'm curious, kind of just looking at the matchup and looking at mostly the front court, because I think that's where a lot of the matchups are going to be. But what are some big keys for Indiana in order to pull out a victory here on Friday?
Well, I mean, for certainly the first couple opening weeks of the season, probably the first couple months of the season, it's just going to continue to be Indiana's three-point shooting. They've done well enough through the first two games, albeit against Morehead State and Bethune-Cookman, but that's just going to be kind of the focus of this team, because with as much talent as they have in the front court, that is more of a certainty, I guess, that there's going to be production there. It's going to be, and to that point, defenses are going to focus on that. They're going to make Indiana shoot 3-pointers. And so IU has to prove that they can do that as well. So that's going to be, I think, one of the biggest factors. I wouldn't be surprised if Xavier, we saw it a lot with IU last year, where they just kind of 5 guys with at least a foot in the paint all around Trayce Jackson-Davis or whoever the big man is. And at least early on, make Indiana knock down a couple threes and then they'll adjust. And there were times last year where the defense never had to adjust. Yeah. IU's going to have to go through that again this year. Early signs are that there's improvements from a couple of guys, and hopefully that carries on. But certainly through this matchup and probably even into conference play, it's just going to be, does IU actually have 3-point shooting this year?
Yeah. Well, switching over to the defensive end too, I think a really interesting kind of dynamic that we're going to see in this game. We're going to stick with the front court because I think that's kind of the more interesting matchup between these two teams. And particularly at this point in the conversation, we don't know if Colby Jones is going to suit up for the Musketeers, at least to the last update that I checked, said it was still up in the air. He's their 6'5" combo guard, very talented player. So sticking with the front court, I think obviously Trayce Jackson-Davis, huge piece for the Hoosiers, but for Xavier, they got really nice players as well. Zach Fremantle, Jack Noonge, they're really talented players. Both guys who can stretch the floor. I think that's a really interesting dynamic of this game. Both these guys are legitimate 3-point shooters, 6'9" and 7 feet tall for these two guys. Iowa transfer, dropped 23 points. That's Noonge. Fremantle had a triple-double in Xavier's first or second game of the season. So two guys who can really do a lot of different things with the basketball. For the Hoosiers, how they play this team defensively, how they're able to really deal with the fact that Xavier can stretch the floor in ways that not a lot of other teams can, that's going to be a huge part of this game. Obviously, it's really early in the year, haven't gotten a lot of opportunities to see what Indiana's front court looks like defensively, at least this squad. But knowing a lot of these guys kind of previously, is this something that you think is going to be kind of a hurdle for the Hoosiers, or is this something that they can kind of handle with this squad?
Yeah, it hasn't been an issue as much. There's been a couple games. Hunter Dickinson absolutely destroyed Indiana in Assembly Hall, but then in the Big Ten tournament game, they did a much better job of defending him. So it's been a mixed bag of success. They are through the first 2 games again, the opponent, but they are defending a little bit differently this year. And that last year it was a lot of trying to keep Trayce around the rim as a rim protector, which he did really well. This year it seems like they want to be more aggressive on the perimeter and really push teams out and force them to kind of initiate offense from really far out. And Trayce, Race, even the backup big men, Jordan Geronimo, Malik Reneau, all are comfortable and athletic enough to defend on the perimeter. My instinct would be it's something that isn't going to be too much of an issue, but like I said, there have been times last year where it was an issue to be frank, in that they did struggle with that at times. But the hope is that having had those games against Michigan is the one that's always going to pop up, that they can kind of learn from that and be better, because they were in the second meeting against Michigan last year, and hopefully that translates into this season as well.
You mentioned Reneau, and I kind of wanted to talk about him a little bit. One of the 2 very exciting freshmen that is joining the Hoosiers team. I think Jalen Hood-Schifino got more attention kind of throughout the offseason. He's been fine through the first couple of games this year, but hasn't necessarily been overwhelming. Reneau, though, he looks really good. He's had a couple really nice performances so far. From having seen him play in those couple of games, with the caveat that they were not against super high levels opponents, and he's getting his first real chance at a high quality opponent here against Xavier. But do you see a potential breakout for this kid? Top 25 recruit, Mount Verde fresh. He played at Mount Verde, really prominent high school. It seems like we could be on the precipice of him really stepping into a big role. If it's not this year, maybe it's after TJD leaves, but he seems like a piece that's going to be a big one for the Hoosiers going forward.
Yeah, if Trayce had left, he would absolutely be starting. And I would argue there's probably not many front courts he wouldn't start on in the Big Ten this season. He's been Really, really good. And as you said, even within Indiana, it was a lot about Jalen Hood-Schifino, not nearly as much about Malik. Part of that was kind of the way he decommitted so late and then chose Indiana. There's excitement, but we didn't really know a lot about his game. And so every time he stepped on the court this year, including a pair of exhibition games, he's looked incredible. And he keeps looking better and better. One of the things that I think is quickly becoming apparent that's going to be a strength for Indiana this year is its bench. They can conceivably go 9 men deep and bring 4 guys off the bench. And Malik is a huge part of that. He has been fantastic in the post, athletic, really a variety of post moves, a lefty. There's a lot of similarities between him and Trayce. Malik isn't nearly as athletic or anything in that regard, but there's a lot of similarities there. And again, we keep having to, even IU fans have to kind of give the caveat of he hasn't really played anybody tough yet, but he's absolutely dominated everybody put in front of him. He's averaging 12 points per game and 16 minutes per game. So his per 40-minute numbers are wild, 29 points and 11 rebounds. So he's done everything he can to impress. He looks like a lot of fun. And yeah, I mean, he's going to be a breakout guy this year, I think, and gives IU a lot more stability, kind of looking forward for life after Trayce Jackson-Davis.
All right, that is going to do it for us today right here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Tons of outstanding college hoops coming your way this weekend. We got tons of good content coming next week as well, recapping and getting ready for all of the MTEs going on in Feast Week. Check out the show wherever you get podcasts, and don't forget to go find us on YouTube. Hit that big red subscribe button. For now, peace.